Thank you very much, Hannah. Thanks to all of you for coming out. Our discussion tonight is on Europe on the edge. And I must hasten to say that when the notion of this debate was put together, many of the events that now form the context for our conversation had obviously not happened. And one of those is the calling of a general election, which was called and summoned to be the Brexit election. And some of you may have been struck by the absence of discussion of Europe and Brexit in this election. And so not for the first time, Intelligence Squared aims to deliver what the politicians and others will not, which is a candid conversation about Europe, which has been missing from this campaign. But obviously the other part of context are the attacks in London on Saturday night and the attacks 2 weeks before in Manchester. And they will inevitably, I think, frame some part of our conversation, and of course, just by all of you being here and this debate going ahead is, I think, a sign that of our collective determination to defy those who would stop us having these conversations and instead to keep on. So I'm going to say more about the context as we get into it, but I want next to really, just having said something about the moment we're in, to say a few words about each of the people, because each of them do come to these topics with a particular expertise. Despite Michael Gove saying we've had enough of experts, we can never get enough of experts here. And so we have assembled here 5 people, all with a unique vantage point and tremendous expertise on our topics that, and there are different ones that might lead to Europe being on the edge. So let me introduce them more or less in physical order. Professor of economics at Oxford and development expert who is widely acknowledged as an expert in the field and acclaimed for his new book, Refuge. He recently turned his attention, as that title suggests, to the subject of mass migration, examining its effects on both the societies that receive migrants and on the countries those migrants leave behind. A warm welcome, please, for Professor Paul Collier. Our next speaker is an award-winning novelist and is the most widely read female writer in her native Turkey. She's a prominent advocate for minority rights and free speech there and elsewhere. You may have read her non-fiction work, her essays in the Financial Times, the New York Times, the New Yorker and the Guardian. A welcome, please, for Elif Shafak. Thank you. Our next speaker on my immediate right was born in Italy and is now the professor of finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He writes frequently on populism, which is obviously, I think, going to be one of our themes tonight, immigration and the state of the Eurozone economy. He recently launched a heated debate in the Italian media about the costs and the benefits of the euro for his native Italy. He is Luigi Zingales. And turning to our speakers who have hot-footed it from the continent to be here. Born in Belgium, but a journalist who became editor-in-chief of the French weekly news magazine L'Express. She now presents a current affairs program on France's equivalent of BBC4. She is Christine Ockrent. And completing our panel, known to many of you, I'm sure, he is a regular writer and columnist for both The Spectator and Standpoint magazine, writes frequently for all kinds of other publications, including the Sunday Times here and the Wall Street Journal in the United States. His current and new book is The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity and Islam, which has now, I think this week, reached the #1 spot in the Sunday Times bestsellers list. He is Douglas Murray. So that is our panel, and we are talking, as I said, about Europe on the edge. That's the subject before us. And I'm guessing that you could carry or hold that thought in your mind applied to many things. You could be thinking of the terror attacks that we've experienced in Britain in these last few weeks, but our neighbours on the continent have been experiencing in recent months too. You could be thinking about the economy. You could be thinking about the phenomenon of mass migration. So I'm going to ask each of our contributors here to set out their stall and tell us, really in just a minute or so, what it is that is making them anxious and what are they worried about and what makes them feel that Europe is on the edge. And why don't I start with you, Christine Ockrent?
Well, I'm actually worried that so many brilliant minds still dwell into gloom and doom at a time where it seems to me Europe is in a much better shape than it was a few months ago. There's that fatal triangle, Mr. Trump, Putin, Erdogan. They compel us to really do our things ourselves. There's also a better economic cycle in the Eurozone. And last but not least, the populist wave seems to have been stopped somehow, certainly in Holland and certainly in France, where Emmanuel Macron, I think, will revigorate and stimulate a much more positive approach to European issues.
And assembly elections coming up in France this weekend,
Indeed, on June 11 and June 18.
So it's not all about us when it comes to elections. There are other elections going on. So thank you, Christine. Why don't we hear from you, Paul Collier, on what's on your mind in terms of what makes you worried about Europe on the edge?
Well, I see Europe as a political project, primarily a political project by the Germans, the French, which some years ago made a catastrophic mistake of using economic instruments as political symbols. And I think that was catastrophic because it produced powerful economic divergence. That potentially gives an incentive for some countries to leave, and I think the Germans have already made it pretty clear that their strategy for stopping any exit is to make British exit as painful as possible. So actually, I'm fearful for the implications of that strategy for us.
So in order to discourage other people from leaving and spreading the contagion, there will be a sort of, this is the punishment beatings model, in which Britain gets take punishment.
Its reparations are back.
Interesting. You've already broken the unspoken rule of all these discussions, which is never to mention the war. You've done it within 4 or so minutes, but somebody was going to do it. Let's hear from you next, Luigi Zingales, about what do you think, what do you have on your mind? What's worrying you?
So I'm worried that Europe, which was in its origin a fantastic project to bring prosperity and harmony in Europe, is actually turning into a prison where people start to build resentments and hate each other more. 20 years ago, the Greeks were not calling the German Nazi, and the Germans were not calling the Greeks lazy. And today, this is an outcome of a ill-conceived economic project that, as Paul said, was conceived by politicians for politicians' means, use economic means in the wrong direction. And unfortunately, has been sold and supported by a lot of economists, but so far with pretty negative consequences. I don't see an end in sight, and I'm sorry, I don't think that even Macron has a magic wand to fix this.
I mentioned at the start that you've kicked off this debate about the euro. Is it your argument that Italy itself should come out of the euro?
I think that it's a bit like Hotel California. You can check out but never leave. I think that it's designed to destroy a country if it leaves. So it's impossible to leave, at least unilaterally. But some nations, and mine is one, suffers tremendously in it. That's the dilemma. And when you force people into a cage, you know you have rage. And that's what is happening.
So we've had 2 very pessimistic views from this side, and we had an optimistic view from Christine. Elif, where are you on this? What's worrying you, if anything, about Europe?
I don't think you should expect an optimistic view from a Turkish writer. We are so depressed. But honestly, coming from a country like Turkey, where diversity, cosmopolitanism has been lost, and the cost of that loss has been tremendous, I am worried about many things in Europe and across the world. I think what has happened in Turkey could happen anywhere. It could even happen here. And while it's true that populist tides seem to have slowed, they have not disappeared. They are there, and we need to talk about them. And to me, it's very interesting to see when populist movements are in opposition, they have an impact beyond their size. So much so that they can change the rhetoric of mainstream politics and politicians. We have seen an example of this in the Netherlands, for instance. Yes, Geert Wilders did not win the elections, but thanks to his presence and his base, mainstream politicians in the Netherlands started to employ a much more nationalistic, jingoistic language during their elections. Now, when populists come to power, this is when they are in opposition. They have an impact beyond their size. When they come to power, history has shown us that they benefit enormously from controlling the state apparatus, the main narrative, but also the media. And thirdly, I think we need to be careful because no matter how isolationist and nationalistic they might sound, they are connected, they are interrelated, we all are. So today's populist movements encourage each other. So yes, Trump's existence also encourages Erdogan and vice versa. And therefore, I think we need to understand that we're all in this together. We have things to worry about, to feel hopeful about as well. But the danger of nationalism, tribalism has not disappeared. And all around the world, we are being told that we all belong in our tribes. And they're telling us that if we go back to our tribes, we will be safer if we're surrounded by sameness. And that's an illusion.
Thank you. I want to come back to populism straight after, but why don't we hear from you, Douglas? You've written a whole book about the death, the strange death of Europe. So you obviously believe Europe is not just on the edge, but has gone over the edge. Just tell us in a very distilled form, if you can, what's on your mind.
Sure. I don't make any apology, by the way, for being gloomy. I think that if the facts are gloomy, you should be gloomy. And I think a huge amount of damage has been done historically and is still being done today by optimists.
I'll have to fight back.
But we might get onto that.
We will.
My view is that, that our continent is in the business of bullet dodging these days, and every time a bullet sort of whizzes past its head, we think, oh, well, it hasn't hit, so it'll be fine for another day. And I think that isn't true, but I think that the real problems are far deeper than the issues that any one election throws up these days, or any one challenger can throw up. My book's about what I see as being the two twin challenges that have come simultaneously. The first is the mass movement of peoples into Europe. And the second is that this should come at the same time that Europeans have lost the sense of what we are or what we're meant to be or whether we're allowed to be or whether we are just the place where anyone in the world who wants to call our continent home can call it home. And I think this is a massive historical issue that's far beyond at the moment the grasp of any politicians in our country to deal with, but it'll be the one that galvanizes us, I think, throughout our lives.
And instead of Europe having a philosophy in which says if you're here then you're European and you can call yourself and think of yourself as being at home, what do you think should be the approach instead?
Well, it would start by recognizing that it isn't the case that anyone in the world who walks into Europe immediately becomes a European. Our historical reasons for getting to some of the ideas we have about separation of church and state, about our wounded attitude towards religion, our attitudes towards politics, in my view, are highly unlikely to just be picked up and arrived at exactly the same moment as we're at by millions of people coming into our continent. And I think that all of our political leaders massively underestimated this, and it may well be impossible to reverse that.
We're obviously going to have to come back to that, and you're going to want to make a defense as a... Christine, you're going to want to make a defense of optimism.
Yes, I think I'm going to feel rather lonely.
No, not necessarily. I'm sure there's lots of optimists out there. Let's just pick up this thing about populism first, because you suggested that in a way the moment had passed, the peak had been reached because Macron won instead of Le Pen. But I thought before we get into it, you mentioned populism too, Elif. Why don't we just say how we're defining it first of all, just in a very short distill away, what do you mean when you say populism?
Well, that's the challenge, isn't it? Because it's so close to democracy, and we're not talking about a problem that originates from outside democracy, but comes from within, and shows us the fragility of democracy. In other words, how do you deal with movements that come to power using the means of democracy? And once they consolidate their power, use that position in order to suppress all voices of dissent one by one.
So Erdogan would be a classic case.
Yeah, the Turkish case is quite interesting, and it really holds important examples for Democrats and, in my opinion, progressives, liberals all around the world. Populism needs dualities. I think that is one of the keys. There always has to be an us and there needs to be a them. The description of the them can change from time to time, but that duality is essential. It also tells us that there's a real people, pure people, versus the corrupt elite. And it presents itself as if it has nothing to do with the establishment, as if it has been zoomed from another planet.
Yeah.
Nothing can convince me that Trump is not part of the financial establishment, or Marine Le Pen herself is not part of the political elite. Of course, we can be critical of the elite's mistakes, but let us not make the mistake of thinking that these populist demagogues are themselves not part of the elite.
Excellent, thank you. So that's an understanding of what populism is. Paul Collier, what role has migration and the backlash against migration played in fueling these populist movements, visible actually in Britain with UKIP, but in France with Le Pen and Holland with Wilders? There's all kinds of examples. How much is this about immigration?
I think, and most in the audience won't like this, but I think what's actually happened is not particularly something to the, well, let's focus on the English working class. I think the English working class now is more or less where it's always been. I think what's walked is the English middle class, which has decided that it doesn't really want to be English. It's walked away from a shared identity with ordinary people. I think this is particularly pronounced in London, I'm afraid. I grew up in Sheffield, right? It was a proper place. And I grew up in an environment, I was surrounded by Scots, left, right, across the road, all Scots. And it never occurred to any of us that we were other than the same identity. They were Scottish, I was English, but we were all British. We just fought a war together. Oh God, I've done it again. Right? And because of that, there was a strong willingness of the fortunate to redistribute to the less fortunate. We were a shared identity. And I think that has gradually corroded. Now, I think where does immigration play into this? It's a bit marginal. It's something that the upper middle class gets very excited about because it can accuse ordinary people of being racist, right? But here's an uncomfortable piece of statistical evidence, right? Across Europe, the higher is the proportion of immigrants in the population, the lower is the willingness of those above median income to make tax transfers to people below median income. Right? That's across Europe. There's also experimental behavioral evidence which explains why that is. I can't go into it. But what that means is people below median income, ordinary people, have a perfectly rational reason to fear that immigration will sort of weaken this sense of shared bonds, and the middle class will just run off, go and do its own thing.
And so sort of redistribution of wealth and the basic sort of fundamentals of social democracy rest, in your view, on there being a degree of homogeneity in a society. Well, once it's too diverse, this is an argument that you and perhaps others have made, once it's too diverse, then the willingness to share becomes reduced.
It has to be a shared identity. That doesn't mean homogeneous ethnic identity or anything like that. It just means a sense of buying into we are all, and the only basis, viable basis for shared identity, you can't buy in on a set of values, because our values in a democratic, open society, our values are all over the place. Right? The one thing you can all agree on is location. We're all British. We all live in the place. And so you need that to become an important, salient feature of identity.
So you will have heard arguments like that in France as well, the French equivalent arguments that now the country has changed, it's so diverse, that the willingness to treat each other as neighbours is less, perhaps. And this is part of what's been driving some of these movements.
I would put it slightly differently from Paul, without, of course, denying his argument. But it's pretty obvious that all over the continent, the middle class has been struck by two phenomena. One is globalization, and the other is the technological revolution, which means that people get to be more and more individualistic, and their approach to their political institutions, their political elites, media elites, business elites become very different. But I think that this idea of a loss of identity is quite distinct from actual migrations. There have been migrations in Europe throughout our history, dating back centuries. It's more the refugee crisis, which has helped populists throughout Europe to say, oh, we're losing our identity. And of course, in places where they have never seen one single immigrant or one single refugee, in France we saw that. We had, Marine Le Pen saying, oh, where has France gone? But at the same time...
she did well in areas where there were not refugees or immigrants.
Of course, but that's been the case, throughout Europe. You don't need to have foreigners to be xenophobic. There's a case in Slovakia, in a place run actually by a neo-Nazi, of an Erasmus student who was just stabbed because he happens to be black. So I think this notion of identity has indeed many more ingredients to it than just the refugee crisis. And I think there's always that ambiguity between the refugee crisis on the one hand and the migration issue on the other.
Elif.
Yes, the issue of identity with the emphasis on the singularity of it, I think it's so crucial in all populist movements. Of course, we're talking about very different examples. We have populisms in wealthy Sweden, but also we have populism in crisis-ridden Greece. There are differences, but this is one of the common areas. Populism doesn't like plurality, multiplicity. And at the end of the day, all populist movements expect us to clarify a singular monolithic identity. Are you a Muslim? Be a Muslim, according to my definition of Islam. Are you a Dutch? You can only be Dutch. You can't be plural, which is completely against our nature, because as human beings, we're made of water. We have multiple belongings. So that is a repetitive, example that we see from country to another, one to another.
Douglas, I want to hear what you say to Christine's point about there's always been waves of immigration. It's just part of European history. Why now is this making you fear that actually Europe itself may be even on the verge of its own death because of this change that you discern in your book and in what you've been writing?
First of all, the point that Christine makes does not prove the case, of course, does it? Because a lot of the areas where people don't like the diversity, shall we say, is because they've had enough of the diversity. It's not because they've never tried it. They've tried it and don't like it. And they go to areas where they can not have more of it thrown down their throat. And that's one of the big issues, isn't it? That everyone who's for the, as it were, endless diversity as a definition of us will always come to is there a moment when there is such a thing as too much? And I think that the people can sense that, and certainly sense it far better than any political or other class. This word, by the way, populism and populist, I don't buy it myself, I don't use it. I think populist is a term that some people use for things they don't like. It's simply a really good and easy way. I mean, let me give you an example. Monsieur Macron ran without a party, effectively formed his own movement, was a one-man show, very charismatic and so on. He's not described as a populist. Why? When Hillary Clinton does the us and them with Wall Street, as she did in her campaign, boasting that she was the only candidate so tough on Wall Street that they actually were fighting against her, who described Hillary Clinton as a populist? If Hillary Clinton had won the election, would it have been a populist win? If Remain had won, would anyone have said this is a populist thing? No.
Is your Prime Minister a populist?
Is our Prime Minister a populist? No. I mean, she's the head of the Conservative Party.
But you did hear a definition. You heard a definition from Elif there earlier, which was when it pits itself against the elite. It says we're the real people, the authentic people, against a foreign elite or a distant elite. And particularly, I'm just giving you Elif's definition. If it uses the techniques of democracy to, in some way, once it has power, to either suppress or just restrain democracy and democratic norms.
First of all, the idea of us and them is a derogatory way of describing what, say, the liberal Dutch novelist Paul Scheffer described when he said, in order to make this work, we're going to need a we. We need a we. We need a first-person plural to describe ourselves as a society. And that is just another way of saying, oh, you're just doing us and them. Well, you do need an us. You do need an us. And as I say, I return to this point. If it is the case, Elif's point that one of the few definitions or the bits of a definition I could find agreement with is this thing of, as it were, overstating the power of elites and overstating your own, nascent ability to connect with the people and so on. Well, fine, but sometimes, people aren't onto nothing. If you were to describe a sort of incredibly disjointed, unelected, far, far high above the people and unaccountable to them thing, what could you do better than come up with the European Commission? Is it always populist? Is it always populist to point that out? I would say no. So sometimes people are onto something. But as I say, I think this is just another way of saying, scare quotes around these people. We would like to call them racist, but we're not sure it'll work anymore, and we're nervous, so we'll call them populists.
Lots of people want to come in. Thank you. Both of you want to come in. I just want to ask you, Luigi, about what your take on this is, because whether or not you accept the definition of either of our two debaters on this point, a lot of people discuss what is driving populism. Is it cultural anxiety, broadly defined, meaning the questions of identity and who is us and perhaps race, or is it just, more simply, economic hardship and pain? Christine mentioned globalization. Other people have talked about automation. People who are left behind economically. That's why they're turning to so-called, we may accept Douglas's worries, so-called populism.
So two things. First of all, I like the definition, but there is a part missing, is the other side. The other side of populism is elitism. And I think that the two are very symbiotic, because you can have populism only when there is an elite that is elitist. And the elitists justify being elitist because they are populist and vice versa. And I think that there is not enough discussion these days of groups that are elite and have contempt to our ordinary people. When Hillary calls deplorable the people who vote for Trump, she's an elitist. When throughout Europe they say, oh, you have to redo the referendum in England because the outcome is not the right one, and we keep going until we get the right outcome, or even sort of a debate whether you should have universal suffrage because the people don't understand, because we are smart and understand, and they don't. I think that's elitism. And I think this elitism is very pervasive. I don't know enough about the UK, but I can tell you in the United States and in Italy is very pervasive. And I think that's part of the problem. And part of the problem is the elite is too separate from the rest of the people. In a sense, social mobility, even in the United States, has gone down tremendously. And you end up interacting only with some kind of people. In the shocking thing, how many friends do you have in the States who voted for Trump? It's very rare to find them. And they were not 50%, they were only 48, but they are 48% of the population. Where are they? That shows how separate from the rest of the people we live, and how elitist we are.
Good. So you can't have populism without elitism. Where are you on this question of whether or not that populist move has peaked Because in France, they just elected in huge numbers a very elitist figure in the form of Emmanuel Macron. There was no anti-elitism there. They were quite happy to embrace him as their new president. Does it mean the feeling you're describing has passed?
I don't think so. I am on the side of people think that the primary cause is economical. And so I think that this is not going away anytime soon. I would be more interested in studying whether France is an exception, maybe because they're more middle class. And so that's the reason why they did not fall so much into that as other places.
Oh, so they were not as left behind?
As left behind and not so outraged. But considering a victory, the fact that a fascist leader got 35% of the vote, sorry, if those are the victories, I don't look forward to defeats.
Yes, and well, I know you want to get on. Paul has been waiting for a while, then Elif. Yeah.
First with Macron, I mean, he faced a Marxist, a fascist, and a crook, and just and he just scraped through by 3%.
You're talking about the first round.
Yeah. Well, that's and then, of course, he faced a fascist, and of course he wins. That is not a resounding victory. I'm sorry, it's not, right? A donkey could have won against that.
A smart donkey.
Sorry, I don't want to be rude. I don't want to be rude about donkeys.
A well-educated
go on to your next
donkey.
point. Yeah.
Now, what I wanted to say was that, incidentally, I entirely agree that the implication of this is that the elites have walked off. It's not the populists have done something weird, it's the elites have walked off. Now, I want to make a distinction in two sorts of nationalism. There's the nationalism that I grew up with in Sheffield. We were all British. Why? Not because of any ethnicity or something. We all lived in the same country and we were proud of that. The nationalism that the populists generate is a very different animal. They're not actually saying, we're all a country. They're saying, we're the country and you're not. And that's a very different thing. There's an inclusive nationalism that I grew up with, and there's an exclusive claiming of a national label by one group or another. And that we've got to oppose. That's the route to fascism. But the idea that to oppose fascism, we have to just say, oh, we're all global citizens, there's nothing else, is crazy. We need shared identity in order to be generous and be cooperative.
So very helpful. So exclusive nationalism is the nationalism you're against. I would think you mean Marine Le Pen would be an example of that. In Britain, would you say UKIP expresses that exclusive nationalism or not?
Yes.
You would say that. Okay, it's clarifying. Christine wants to come back, and then we must hear from Elif. Yeah.
Well, after this praise of Britishness, all I can try and say that France has gone through an extraordinary presidential campaign where indeed the diversity of opinions, the violence in the political climate, and indeed the way citizens have engaged and have indeed given, not to a donkey, I'm sorry, but to a young man who was extremely visionary in the way he took advantage of these extraordinary circumstances. The turnout was very high. He won by a very wide margin the first round and a wider margin the second round. So I think all these ironical comments about the fact that anybody, including a donkey, might have won is out of place. We have a presidential system with a two-round election, and indeed we will see again in June for the parliamentary elections if that young man who ran without a political party has been able to build a political party, which is, I think, a very good omen to the capacity of our European democracies not to be as tired as they are supposed to be, and indeed to be able to renew their elites, their political elites, and indeed again, rejuvenate
Yes.
our system.
Just respond to
I think that's fairly positive.
Good. Just
as far
respond
as
to
I'm
Luigi's.
concerned.
Just respond to Luigi's point, though, which is
Yes.
good. Macron did very well. We all know that, but it's not that encouraging that a fascist, his words, like Marine Le Pen, could poll as much as she did. That is actually troubling.
Yes, indeed, and that's precisely because of what Paul said. That there was an extreme left, an extreme right, and a conservative candidate who turned out to be, if not a crook, at least to be, how could I put it, very careless about public money.
Okay.
But
Beautifully
I don't
French.
agree.
Beautifully French. Listen, pause there, because I must get in, Ellie.
No. Just one point about
really
Luigi.
brief.
I don't agree. Holland is a typical case in point that Holland is a very prosperous country, and yet it still has a far right. So it's not always economic reasons which account for quote-unquote populists.
Yeah, thank you. And that's, well, and some of the more affluent parts of the United States voted for Trump as well. So we can come back to that. Ellie, if you've been wanting to get in, I also want to make sure that you know that we are going to talk about terrorism as an issue for Europe. And I want to hear you, Elif, and you, Douglas, and then we're going to get on to terrorism.
I mean, first, the emphasis on shared values, I think it's incredibly important. For many of my British, French friends, the entire EU debate was a primarily financial, economic debate. For us, those of us who come from the periphery of Europe, for us it's mainly a debate on shared values and the danger of losing those shared values. And the importance of having a supranational umbrella that brings people from different backgrounds around shared values, to me, is very important. I do not think that nationalism of any kind can be inclusive. And we have to make a difference there between maybe nationalism and patriotism. It is perfectly okay, understandable, and beautiful for us to have emotional attachments to the cultures, lands, families where we come from. But nationalism as an ideology is a very dangerous thing. And again, people coming from Turkey, the Middle East, the Balkans, we have seen the dangers of all of that. With regards to populism, populists are not the reason why we are in this mess. They are there because there has been a mess in the first place. So it is the outcome of democracy in trouble. It is the outcome of a crisis. We do have a crisis that we need to talk about. And I do not think that that crisis can solely be understood by looking at economic or financial inequality. By no means, I'm not belittling, underestimating the importance of economic gaps, but we need to talk about other things as well, particularly emotions, which has been so underestimated in mainstream political theory. But I do believe that this is the age of anxiety, angst, anger. It is perfectly understandable for people to worry whether their children are going to find a job. You know, it's perfectly understandable that the people are worried that, yes, there will be too many refugees, and to be worried about terrorism. If we do not allow them to speak their anxiety, to talk about it, if we don't have open spaces and judge them on the basis of their emotions, I think we will be pushing them towards the far right. To me, it's very interesting to see. Okay. Let's go back a few years. We had the Arab Spring, we had the financial crisis, we had the Euro crisis, Brexit, Trump. Many times, including the polls, the experts got things wrong. We need to talk about these things. How is it possible? But where we are right now is many populist demagogues, and I think we need to use this word, they are saying to the people, you know what? These people, the elite, they're always getting it wrong. And you are the pure people. You just need to trust your guts, your instincts. You don't need these intellectuals. Yeah. So the denigration of the intellect, to me, is a very dangerous trend. One more thing I want to add.
No, we've got lots of time, because we must move it on. You will have more time. I want to make the transition to talk about terrorism, because it's obviously in our minds in this city, this now, and then I want to open it up. So I want to hear your different. We've talked about populism and what might be driving that, and what might define it. But Douglas, I know you wanted to get on the other thing, but if you can, let's pivot to this issue. And everyone is asking themselves the same question, which is what is causing this, and is this something that is merely visited upon Europe, or is this something that on some level has been caused by decisions Europe and Europeans have taken?
Well, firstly, let me just say that there is a narrative, we've heard a little bit of it so far, that the publics of Europe are being led astray by talented demagogues. It's possible as well that the publics of Europe have seen a political class fail to get a grasp of very major things or even talk about them, and that the public have noticed facts, and that it's not that there's a meta-narrative that's going around, there are just facts. There are things that we can see with our eyes, there are things that are clear to us, which politicians daren't tread on. And I've had this experience throughout my life. I never forget the time, many years ago, I think when France first banned the headscarf, I've told this story before, of a Labour MP in a studio with me discussing the rights and wrongs of this, and spent the whole time with me. An Iranian friend of mine was also there, explaining why we were fascist and Islamophobic and so on for defending the French Republic's verdict on the headscarf. And we came out, and this Labour MP patted me on the back and said, "Never forget, Douglas, we're all with you." And I said, "Well, what was that all about on air?" Which was the more pertinent moment. And he said, "Look, I've got a large Muslim constituency and I can't do anything in this area." And that's what you hear all the time in private. And the politicians, when I say this to them, their eyes go huge. They daren't tread onto this. But there's a very straightforward fact, I'm afraid, on this terrorism thing that has to be confronted. Extremism and violence can come from absolutely any community, pretty much. I mean, even Buddhists, when riled up in certain parts of the world, can become violent. The Quakers, I think, we can't go for, but but pretty much every community. So I accept that. This is not something to be picked up on. But Islamic extremism only comes from the Islamic religion and from followers of it. And that is an imported problem for Europe. That's a problem that we've brought in and we're now facing. Now, none of our politicians, by the way, and there's no great conspiracy about this, nobody expected it. If you'd have said to a politician in the 1990s, in the early years of the 2000s, Europe is going to be racked by blasphemy debates, they'd say, "What are you talking about? When did the Spanish Inquisition return?" And then we all became used to it, that there were certain things you couldn't do that were actually blasphemy in a country like this and were punishable effectively by death, by a death sentence. We all accepted that. And now we're told we have to accept the terrorism. Well, maybe we do have to accept the terrorism as part of our life, but the publics have a right to be looking at the politicians and saying, "Look, this is a problem you brought in." It's not only to be talked about. It's not only to be talked about as a problem, but unless we're willing to do that bit of identifying, to my mind, the gap between what the public can see and what the public know, and what the political class is even willing to whisper, will continue to grow, and that's the gap where you have to worry.
So who wants to take on what Douglas has said? Christine, you come back on this.
I would like to add another comment. I'm not disputing Douglas this time around.
I want to hear from somebody who does, though. So I'm looking
It's
over you.
interesting that in France we've had this very critical approach of the British view about multiculturalism, communitarism, which in our vocabulary are really bad words. And there has been a great deal of French self-delusion about the idea that our secular culture would actually integrate rather than assimilate, and that indeed our second or third generation of immigrants coming from former colonies, which is also the case, I believe, in this country, would naturally believe that Astérix or Vercingétorix was their ancestors and that our education system would transform them. It has worked to a point, especially with girls, better so than with young men. But we have discovered, and indeed, as we all know, France has been struck by terrorism, homegrown terrorism, French citizens, most of the time, as indeed British citizens in this case. And so it shows that for 2 or 3 generations, not only our politicians, but our societies have not really measured the difficulty of giving a proper identity to these people, because it's also a sign of an identity crisis, turning to that kind of ideology. It's not even religion, it's an ideology. And that shows that it is indeed a dimension no one has taken into account, and not only our politicians.
Douglas, you're going to come back, but I wanted somebody to push back on the basic case Douglas made right at the beginning, or just a moment ago rather, that somehow this is a problem that has been brought into Europe by, I presume, Douglas means the immigration of Muslims in big numbers.
There's no doubt that when you look at the Muslim world in general, there are lots of problems. We have enormous problems with regards to women's rights, LGBT rights, freedom of speech, human rights, and we got lots of things that we should be criticizing, and we are criticizing. But it would also be a very big mistake to think that the Muslim world is a monolithic whole and that all Muslims are similar and they have a similar worldview. In fact, they do not. There are enormous differences. There always were, historically, and today as well, depending on whom you talk to, which country, what time you're focusing on. The differences are amazing. My worry is extremists in one place are creating more extremists elsewhere. Whether we like it or not, we're all far too globalized to think that by closing our doors and surrounding ourselves by walls, we will be safe and away and removed from all these problems. We won't. We're all of us in this together. It is a massive, terrorism is a big international global problem, and it can only be solved through global solidarity. With regards to the burkini ban in France, I sincerely believe it was very, very wrong. It was a big mistake. I think we should be criticizing faith-based schools, we should be criticizing extremist preachers, we should definitely monitor what people are saying in the mosques, but for God's sake, chasing women who are just wearing their burkinis on the beach, that is not the way forward. And it's even more dangerous because what's happening is, and this is not what we perhaps are not aware of much, those pictures, do you remember the picture of one lady wearing a burkini in France and 3 French policemen by her? Unfortunately, that very photograph has been circulated in Turkey, in Jordan, in Egypt, with awful captions saying, you see, this is what they're doing to our women.
All staged, with a TV crew called upon just to take the picture.
This is very dangerous.
The Catholic nuns are dressed the same way with a burkini,
okay.
and you allow them to dress like that. Why do you go after? This is crazy.
Can I suggest
Douglas,
something? May I suggest something?
Can I just finish just
okay,
one
yeah, Elif, I cut you off before, so we'll let you finish now. Yeah, and then
I come from a country, because Turkey and France have lots of similarities. The laïcité we have borrowed directly from France, not the Anglo-Saxon secularism. And Turkey has applied the headscarf ban. Iran has applied the headscarf ban. It didn't work. It created massive problems. But yes, we all share the same aims with regards to how do we prevent extremism, how do we prevent terrorism, but let's also find more progressive ways forward than chasing women with burkinis.
Douglas.
First of all, sorry, Elif, but the burkini ban is a massive diversion. A massive diversion. It was a big mistake for the French state when that happened, I agree, but this is not the biggest issue. The biggest issue is that just up the road, again, a few days ago, 3 men with machetes went through a London street hacking at people saying this is for Allah. Okay? That's our problem. And this is always the way with this. We always have diversions, and some of these diversions we bring upon ourselves. But let me just get back to the main point. We have had historically massive issues in Europe. Nobody who knows anything about our history wouldn't pretend that. But this is a civil war within a religion which was not our war, and it has become our war. It has become our war, and Elif, you are right and wrong. You are totally wrong to say that there isn't some agreement on this. If you are a Muslim and you follow Islam, you believe that the Quran came from God, and you believe that what is in it is at least very hard to run against. And so now we have a situation in a country like this one, where actually the majority of British Muslims want being gay, like I am, to be made illegal now, okay? So we had a nice liberal agreement in recent decades over being gay. And now you import a community which actually thinks not just that they're not on board with gay marriage, but they think it should be made a lock-upable offence. Where does that come from? It comes from Islam. Okay? Where do all these things come from? They come from this, and I'm sorry, but it is a much worse problem than we think. Okay, one poll last year showed that 50% of British Muslims would not go to the police if they knew somebody involved in an ISIS-like group was around them. Another poll showed 2/3 of British Muslims saying they would not go to the police if they knew somebody involved in extremist activity. What the hell are we doing? What the hell are we doing in ignoring that?
Okay, Douglas, let me...
Yeah, but this is so
I know, Elise.
unfair.
I will. I'm going to let you come back. I just want to press Douglas on a question because I want to know if we accept what you said, and obviously a lot of people in this room do, and I think quite a lot don't. I want to know what you do with this sentiment because you have just described an issue, a difference with not just the people who went on a murderous rampage in Borough Market, but with Britain's entire Muslim community, 2 or 3 million people. So what are you actually practically saying? You're saying that this is a faith that didn't exist here before, therefore a problem that didn't exist here before. Are you suggesting these 2 or 3 million British citizens somehow have to now leave the country?
No, of course not. Of course.
So what are you suggesting?
The first thing is you admit this issue and you slow down or stop the flow. The obvious thing, if you've got a problem, admit to it and slow the flow. Okay? The second thing is, obviously, you try to work on the people you have here. Obviously. You can't...
What does work on mean?
Well, you hope that over many, many generations things will change. Of course, the problem we all have is a situation like the case of Salman Abedi. This country gave his parents asylum. They fled from Libya. We gave his parents asylum. Now we're working out what his parents actually believed. But actually, then 2 weeks ago, their son goes into a Manchester arena and blows up 22 people, one for every year of life this country gave him. So we could be in a situation where we're saying, okay, the first generation are fine, but we've no idea what their children are going to do. And I would very quickly make this point.
Really quickly,
if you want to see the depth of this problem and a possible solution, see who the most vilified people in the Muslim community in this country, they are the reformers. Every single case, it's the reformers. Okay, and one of the London Bridge attackers last year attacked an imam who's a friend of mine in London. Okay, everybody knows this. The reformers are on the edge of this, and this is the point. Okay. The reformers may lose, and that used to be a big tragedy for the Islamic world, and now it's a tragedy for Britain.
Okay, Elif wants to come in, and then we're going to questions. Quick response from you, and then we must hear from our audience. Yeah.
I think it's really unfair. I mean, what makes us think that all of us, we are incredibly worried about what's happening, and I believe all of us want to find a solution forward. It's only how we're going to find a solution. That's what we are debating. I never said that this was not an essential thing. I moved to England, and maybe when you are an outsider, when you are a latecomer, you appreciate it even more. You love it even more. So that's a different thing. But what I'm trying to say is we're so used to having these debates on both sides of the Atlantic. When you bring one speaker who criticizes Islam and then another speaker who defends Islam, and they keep fighting and quarreling, I've never liked that. Sure. I never wanted to be part of that. I'm not even a believer myself, But I'm someone who's interested in dialogue, in peace, in faith, and I do note that the way forward is not by generalizing communities. The biggest problem we have today is how do we communicate with people who are not necessarily in this room? How do we find the same language? How do we reach out to girls, boys who do, yes, some of them come from conservative families, and yes, indeed, we must stop these fanatics, extremists. But if in doing so, we generalize all Muslims, I'm very worried that we are adding fuel to the fire of extremists.
I didn't generalize, I gave you very specific things.
Let's pause it there. Let's begin to hear some questions and reactions from all of you. I'm hoping there are people with microphones, and there's one over there. So keep your hand up there. Keep it up so that the lady there can go. And your guess to the woman there, that's good. And let's get a third one lined up. If you, lady in red, the t-shirt there, I'm hoping she's got a microphone. She's walking across purposefully. Okay, then up there. Good. So we'll begin over here.
My question is, what is the role of technology and the internet with all of this? Because it seems there is a parallel time frame for the last 10, 15 years with social media, multimedia coming into the forefront of everybody's lives and correlating with the rise of terrorism and all of these questions.
Thank you. And the question there, yeah.
There's clearly a threat of people going to Syria and then coming back. Where do you stand on what should happen there?
Thank you. Very specific one, and then we'll hear from you there. Yeah.
Yeah. Hello. I have a twofold question. One is about identity. I think, like, I'm from Germany, and coming to a broad country, I learned a lot about my own identity. If you have nothing to compare your own identity with, how do you really know your own identity? And I want to make a second point. In Germany, over 800,000 refugees came. We didn't know who those people are. People welcomed them. People really, really engaged into the community, helped, and they still do. There's a small minority which is really loud and is complaining about them, and there's a huge majority which really helps and engages with those refugees to integrate them. So what do you think about that when you talk about those huge flows of immigrants into England, because I can't see them?
Don't put the microphone back yet just yet. I want to ask you a question. Of those million refugees that Germany very famously welcomed, if, heaven forbid, but if one of them even was later involved in an act of terrorism, I know, I just want to, because we had the case, obviously that has happened, but I'm just interested in because of what Douglas said about the case of somebody, Salman Abedi, who was granted asylum in this country and then went on to kill. Does that change your view of the million who have been welcomed?
I don't think so, because also hundreds of thousands of Turks came 50 years ago and nothing really much happened. So if there's one person out of 1 million.
Okay. Let's hear thank you for that. Let's hear the question that's there. And I think you've got a microphone up there. Oh, no, you haven't. No, you haven't. Okay. That's plenty oh, you've got one there? Okay, we'll hear one more and then we're going to bring it back here.
Got a question. Hello. Got a question for Douglas. You talk about wanting to stop the flow, Douglas. Do you support a religious test for immigrants coming to Europe or Great Britain?
Okay, thank you. Why don't we start first of all with this point about technology and the internet. I'm going to look to you to this, Luigi, because it's obviously played a big part in driving populism, I would have thought, because of automation and putting people out of work. But do you think it's played, and what role has it played in the spread of terror?
I think that technology is always used by criminals to become sort of more sophisticated, and the police has to catch up. I think that I don't think that internet per se is any different than a lot of technology that have been introduced. And I think that we need to pay some costs in order to have the police monitor the situation and trying to catch them early on. I think that a lot of people got upset for the NSA spying, etc., but some monitoring is necessary for checking this.
But for example, Theresa May says that the encryption that you have with some messaging services, WhatsApp, for example, has to end because it enables terrorists to talk to each other without any possibility of monitoring their conversation. Where would you be on something like that?
I'm not an expert on the details, but I think that it is a bit dangerous to guarantee complete encryption on every dimension. This is for terrorists, but also for other criminals. In Italy, we have fewer terrorists, but a lot of mafia is not any better.
Yeah, sure. Paul Collier, you wrote your book, Refuge. You heard the testimony of somebody from Germany there, who the most famous sort of refugee movement of recent years, 1 million arriving there. What does it do to your attitude, but also to public attitudes about refugees, if even one out of 1 million then goes on to kill and maim, as we saw in Manchester? Is it making our whole attitude to refuge change?
I think this German decision of the moment was truly unfortunate, because what it's done is turn people around across Europe, including Germany, instead of looking at refugees and feeling compassion, they look at refugees and feel fear. And that's a disaster. Of course, it rapidly became completely unpopular in Germany, which is why Chancellor Merkel immediately then slammed the door within months, right? And not only slammed the door, but then did a deal with your great leader to ship them back. So this is not noble, but the real reason why it was really unfortunate, apart from this business of turning the biggest asset of refugees, the compassion we should feel for them, into fear, the biggest problem is that it was a really foolish thing to do. There's 10 million displaced Syrians, and most of them have fled into the neighboring countries, Turkey, Jordan. I've been working with the Jordanian government the last 3 years. And what those refugees want is the restoration of normality. They want jobs. They want autonomy. Very few, only a tiny minority go to the refugee camps, because there it's this model of you feed you, shelter for free forever. What people do is go to the towns to work. And the big tragedy is nobody's brought work. Germany was in a wonderful position to bring jobs to refugees. Instead, it basically had this model, if you can swim to Germany fast enough, we'll take you in. Yeah. So that produced a lot of people who drowned, because there was no mechanism of getting them there. But even on top of that, it was incredibly selective. Okay. I reckon that about less than 5% of Syrians are in Germany, but something between a third and a half of all Syrians with university degrees are now in Germany. Yeah. They're the very people who'll be needed to rebuild Syria.
Although it may actually help Germany. Yeah. But they may, it's bad for Syria, but they may end up with the best and the brightest arriving in Germany.
And that would be selfish, not noble.
Maybe. Let's hear from you, Elif, on this question. I know you've got something else to say, but people asked about, a question asked about the issue of people, it was from here, who've gone to Syria and then want to come back. And obviously, many of those who left from here went through Turkey to get to Syria. What should be the policy now, not just in Britain, but in other European countries, for the so-called returners from those countries?
No, I see it as a massive problem, and I'm just appalled that, especially with the London Bridge attacks, these people were not hiding what they were, what they believed in. It was so obvious because they liked the propaganda, they liked to boast, and still it wasn't or it couldn't be chased. To me, it's a big problem. Certainly, those who go to Syria, mostly to Syria, but to other countries as well, where they are more radicalized even, I think it should be monitored. And I am with you. There are lots of big internet companies that need to change their attitude from now on, because this is the world we're living in. With regards to the refugees, yes, I mean, Europe's position in general, EU's position, I should say, sorry, I don't think is sustainable at all, because most of the refugees, as you pointed out, have been divided, outsourced in a way, trying to outsource the problem to Turkey, to Jordan, and to Lebanon. Several times, Jordanian government said, we can't do it anymore, it's not sustainable. In Turkey, we have close to 3 million refugees, Syrian refugees. It's a big mess right now. On humanitarian grounds, it's wonderful that, of course, Turkey welcomed them, but we have big problems, from security to gender issues that we don't talk about. And also, I think it is not admirable at all that EU for a long time postponed talking about freedom of speech violations in Turkey, human rights violations in Turkey, because it was like part of the barter not to talk about these issues. That's where you lose. That's how you lose respect. But I just want to add this, because it never makes the headlines. We have a big problem with child brides. You rightly so mentioned those Syrian child brides. Yeah. In Turkey, the number of child brides increased dramatically after Syrian refugees. We already had 1 in 4, every 4 marriages in Turkey was with child brides, but now even the numbers increased. The number of Turkish men marrying Syrian girls, women as their second wives, third wives increased, polygamy. So these are issues we don't talk about. But also it's important to notice, because of the entire mess, because of the dangers of the journey, most of the refugees who could make it to Europe are men, young men within a certain age bracket. This is so much so that in Sweden, in countries like Sweden, it even affected the gender ratio.
Yes. Okay, thank you. A question was put to Douglas, I think prompted Douglas by your remark that the one thing you must do is to stop or reduce the flow.
Yeah.
Therefore, the questioner asked, do you support a religious test for immigrants to this country? And I suppose what was in his mind was, if you don't, how on earth would you be able to reduce the flow?
First of all, of course, we've got to remember that we've been talking about asylum a lot, and certainly now the people coming into southern Europe, certainly into the Italian points of entry, are not asylum seekers in the way that we're seeing. They're not Syrians. They are economic migrants looking for a better life, and that has always, in recent years, been a massive part of this. And these two things are constantly elided, deliberately elided, and I think dangerously elided. So yes, I could well get on board with a religious test. For instance, in recent years, there has been a significant genocide on our continent, on our planet, rather. Yazidis, who were almost wiped out a couple of years ago. I could certainly get on board with something that prioritized asylum seekers if they're Yazidis, or Coptic Christians.
I can see what you're doing. I can see what you're doing there, Douglas, and that's good. What I'm saying is, would you want a religious test that didn't prioritize Yazidis, everyone finds that admirable, but would actually rule out and prevent Muslims from granting entry into this country?
I can't see the sense in keeping a high level of economic migration from the Muslim world, no.
So yes, a religious test to prevent Muslim migrants.
Secondly, very quickly, the gentleman at the back from Germany. First of all, it's not the case that it's been fine with Turkish migration since the Gastarbeiter period. Merkel herself said in 2010 that it had been a disaster. Then 5 years later, she made the disaster far bigger. But in 2008, Erdogan went to Germany and spoke to tens of thousands of Turks in Europe from the Netherlands, Belgium, and Germany, and said at a massive public rally, "Do not integrate, but get involved in politics because we need you." I'm sorry, this is subversion. This is outright subversion of European democracies. So yes, we had a problem. And as for the, as it were, would it matter if 1 in 1 million became a suicide bomber? Again, it's a cost-benefit analysis, isn't it? As long as you're not the one standing outside the wine bar in Ansbach when the suicide bomber goes off, it might be okay for you. It might be okay, and it seems to be for most people in our political parties in Britain, it might be okay for you to not worry about this identity question, not worry about the numbers, but you've just got to hope your kids don't like Ariana Grande and go on the wrong night. But I think the cost-benefit analysis of this has to be weighed up, and if you do think that, then say it. Say, we'll take a suicide bombing every now and then. We'll take the stabbings every now and then. Sure.
Christine wants to come back, and then I want to hear another one. Yeah.
Just a reminder that most terrorist attacks that have happened in this country, as well as in France, have been committed by our citizens, by people having British or French or Belgian citizenship. But that's, again, the issue. How come our societies have not been able to cope with this generation of young people who have been through our schools, have benefited from our education, have been taught to share our values, and still turn to that murderous ideology?
What's your answer? What's your answer to that question, to your own question?
Again, an issue of identity, that somehow we haven't been able to give them an identity which they can share into.
Okay. Sorry, go on.
It's an ideology, even more so than a religious issue, and unfortunately, in this case, Islam is contaminated with that particular ideology.
Okay. Let's see some more hands, because there's lots of people, I'm sure, lots of people who want to express themselves. Let's bring gentlemen there. Let's say you got somebody there, and have you got somebody There. Okay, well, and we'll probably, I know lots of hands, we're not going to be able to get you all, but I'll do my best. Yes, let's hear from you.
How has our foreign policy contributed to the problems we're facing today?
Good, thank you. Could you bring the microphone to this gentleman here in readiness? Meanwhile, we'll go to there. Yep. Over there. Yep.
I was going to ask the same question.
Okay, we'll go to whoever, sorry, bad luck. We'll go to you gentleman in the front.
Our title is Europe on the Edge, and as you said in your introduction, a lot has changed since this title was given. The European project has developed from 6 countries to 28 countries, with a single market, with a single currency.
Yep.
Is the cause of the problem of being on the edge this drive towards a single state, which would result possibly in all countries' citizens losing their identity?
Okay, that's away from the terrorism topic, but absolutely on our bigger theme. Yes, you've got a question here.
Oh, we've talked a lot about migration coming from the Middle East, but there seems to be an enormous amount of migration coming from Africa. Can the panel give some idea about what we should do? Because it seems countries are losing a lot of their young men, and they're all coming to Europe.
Okay, so you're meaning from, your worry is for Africa's sake about losing their own people, is it? What people should do. Okay, we've got somebody over there.
So,
yeah.
This is a question for, referring to the idea that this problem was imported, actually, the UK has a colonial past and in several occasions has invited immigration in order to rebuild the country after the war. So it's a bit unfair to say that in convenient times we welcome immigrants and then we shut our doors.
Thank you. To those people who are going around with microphones, do make sure we get a balance, a mix of men and women, because we've had quite a few from men, but we'll go from here. You've got somebody there, have you? Yeah.
Yes, I'm wondering if the panel can talk about why the Scandinavian countries are consistently scoring as the happiest places on earth.
What a cheery question to lighten the gloom. You've got something there, yeah.
Thank you. My question was, we are possibly likely to have a government when it comes in that may say that we need to have reduced freedoms in order to reduce terrorism. Is it worth it?
Thank you. I'm going to take 2 more, and then we're going to have answers and closing remarks, I'm afraid. So we'll have 2 more. You've been very patient. The young man here who's got his arm up, but you've been beaten to it by this man. He's going to do one, and he'll pass it to you. Go on. That may be it, I'm afraid. Yeah.
One or two members of the panel are very keen on ensuring there's more culture and diversity, etc. So if you took Britain as an example, particularly those northern towns, and focusing purely on culture, what aspects of Saudi Arabia, Somalia and Afghanistan's culture would the panel like to see more of that's missing from Britain?
Okay, and you pass the microphone here, yeah.
Yeah, seeing as the panel are all being expected to have an opinion on it, on Islam, I'd just like to know out of interest, how many of the panel have studied the Quran, the Hadith and the life of Muhammad in detail, please?
Okay, that's, okay. We'll do one, this will be the very last one here.
Yes, hello.
Okay, not doing much for my gender balance record, but okay, I'll allow you in anyway. Go on.
As a dual British and Israeli citizen, my concern, having seen things happen in the past, is how the impact of extremist violence is going to affect elections, especially coming in the next couple of days here. And I'm wondering what the panel see that as, what concern they see in that.
Okay, well, there's lots there. I'm sorry, people, I couldn't get in. We are beginning to run out of time, and I want to give our panel a chance to react to some of those questions and make some closing remarks as well. Why don't we begin with, well, Paul Collier, I'm going to ask you to tackle the one question that came up that wasn't really about the terrorism issue. It took us back to our bigger subject about Europe and to what extent the European project was in trouble and on the edge because of this insistence, as the questioner saw it, on driving towards a single European state. I mean, for Britain, this argument was rehearsed very strongly a year ago, and it was settled one very clear way. But obviously, the questioner feels it's ongoing for the rest of Europe. Why don't you take that question, Paul, and any other closing thoughts you might have?
Sure. I think the European project is a fantasy of old men who are fighting an old battle. They're trying to stop Germany and France having another war, and Germany and France are not going to have another war. I mean, here's to my mind, the acid test. Norway is not in the euro, it's not even in the European Union. The Netherlands is in both. If we go back to the 1940s, Germany invaded both of them. Is Germany now more likely to invade Norway than the Netherlands, right? Obviously the answer is no, right? The peace that's descended on Europe is nothing to do with this damn institution, right? The institution was because of a revolt against war. So the cultural shift created the institution, not the institution, the cultural shift. I think the attempt by these old guys to create a supranational set of institutions without any chance of getting a supranational identity is going to fail big time. I think I work a lot on societies where the structure of power has diverged from the structure of identity. In most of the societies I work on, identity is local and power is highly centralized, and power doesn't turn into authority. And then you've got a real problem. And in Europe, power hasn't turned into authority. The directives of the European Commission, when they're inconvenient, are just ignored.
I was going to put up, thank you. I wanted to put to you one other thing, just because it strikes me that you may be best placed to answer this. The question that came from over there was about the extent to which Britain, in a way, if you think this is now a problem, it only has itself to blame, in big quotation marks, because of the invitation to populations that were previously ruled as colonies by Britain to come here as immigrants. And the question said, in partly to repair and rebuild the country after the war. And so there's a history to this decision. It wasn't as if Muslim communities from Pakistan, etc., just came here randomly. There was a colonial history to this.
Sorry, but the big surge in immigration has been the last 20 years. We weren't rebuilding the country the last 20 years, I'm sorry. So it was a big change of immigration policy, which created quite a problem.
Okay.
The idea that this idea that it's British foreign policy that's caused the problem. I work mainly on Africa, but always, Europe, in the last vestiges of neocolonialism, is that whatever happens in the world, it's because of something we've done. We're obsessed by, and just look at the massive variation across Europe in attitudes to Iraq war and what have you. And you look where the terrorism has been, Sweden, Norway, Germany, France, Spain. This is nothing to do with British foreign policy. I'm sorry.
Okay, thank you. Elif, why don't you tackle that question? The questioner asked, what role has foreign policy played in the creation as a driver of terrorism? Why don't you take that one, and also anything that, some closing thoughts you might have?
I think we need to highlight there is a clash, obviously, but this is not a clash between civilizations, it's not a clash between religions, it is a clash within nations. Within every nation there are conflicting, clashing values. There is one big such clash in Turkey, in the Middle East, within Europe as well, and they're all connected. We need to be aware of history. I think memory is important. Memory is a responsibility. I disagree. I think there was a reason why the entire journey of EU started in the first place. And yes, the Brussels elite did make lots of mistakes, but it's possible to reform EU. Let's not take things for granted that easily. The journey started not necessarily as a financial project, but let us not forget, upon the ruins of the Second World War, people who were very much aware of the dangers of nationalism, jingoism, militarism. Maybe it won't come from Germany, but maybe it will come from Russia. Maybe it will come from somewhere else, but that danger is already there. We're not necessarily going forward. Sometimes we make the same mistakes that our ancestors have made. To me, it's very important to understand that we are all of us in this together. The more we create us versus them, the bigger the mess. Immigration is a two-way road. When I look at the Turks and Kurds in Germany, yes, as a woman, with liberal values, it bothers me that there's so much nationalism, so much religiosity, so much sexism among some of the Turkish and Kurdish communities. But I'm also aware that I cannot generalize. I'm also aware that they have contributed enormously. But just to give you an example, because you mentioned Erdogan, Erdogans of this world create Geert Wilders of this world and vice versa. They keep feeding each other. Okay. So when Erdogan gave that speech to the Turks in the Netherlands, it was a huge, in my opinion, mistake. But that also benefits Geert Wilders and his populist parties. Just one final example. When you look at how the Turks and Kurds across Europe voted, it's very interesting. 70% of the Turks in Germany voted pro-Erdogan. 72% of Turks in the Netherlands voted pro-Erdogan. In the UK, 80% voted against Erdogan. Just even this example shows us the diversity within immigrant communities, even within the Turkish community, let alone the entire Muslim world. Let us please not make sweeping generalizations about an ethnicity or a religion or a race.
Thank you. Three of you still to speak, and I know that we are holding people later than we expected, and people have dinner reservations and the like, so I'm going to gallop through. Please, now that you know that, you've got to be brief. Christine or Creighton, this question to you was the one about reducing freedom in order to enhance security. Is it worth it?
Well, I think we live in contradictions. On the one hand, we ask for better protection. On the other hand, we want our freedoms. It is obvious that the technological revolution that we've all been addicted to has added to the danger, because obviously all these terrorists are as good or even better than most of us at using the same technologies. And I'm not sure at all that even if the GAFA, all these big American companies, would agree and subscribe to their own government requests, I'm not even sure they would be able to control the contents. So I'm afraid this is another dimension. I think our liberties will be reduced. I'm not sure that it will eventually work all that well. But again, it is a contradiction in our democracy in France. We've been living in a state of emergency for more than 16 months now. We've become used to having
and has it made you safer?
Machines.
Has it made you safer?
Well, it seems that many terrorist attacks have indeed been prevented.
Right.
But one terrorist attack is always one too many.
Of course. Okay, there are two of you left. I want you to, Luigi, it's hard to ask you this because you're not, well, actually, no, I'm going to go to Douglas next because I want you to have the last word. Douglas, to you, the question, will terror affect these elections? Because other countries have had experience of terror attacks during election campaigns. Do you think the ones that have happened in this country will affect the outcome on Thursday? And perhaps, we'll take that and anything else that's struck you.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I would be very surprised if, in the wake of increased terror attacks, the British people thought it was best to put their security in the hands of Mr. Corbyn.
So that means you do think there's an outcome?
Very quickly, well, there have only been two groups of people in recent years who've tried to blow up the British people, the IRA and Islamists. And one of the very few things that links them is the support of Mr. Corbyn. I hope the British people will make their voice heard on that. Very quickly, look, all of this stuff is part of what the point of my book is to try to look at the deeper things underneath this. Our continent is racked by guilt, it's racked by tiredness, existential exhaustion, a whole range of things that mean we are very vulnerable to anyone who comes along and says it's our fault. We're very vulnerable to it, and it's, I have to say, high time we snapped out of it. When I was last on the Greek islands, the reception islands at the camps where migrants were coming in, I was speaking to people from such a wide range of countries. Bangladesh, for instance. What's this country done to Bangladesh recently that should be a reason for us to be continuing to take in people from that country? And what's your solution if people who think that? You can't solve Syria. What are you going to do to solve Eritrea? And you think that in the meantime, We have to continue the current wave of migration. It's madness. Very quickly, to the Scandinavian countries, I don't buy it. All happiness studies are bunk. Total bunk. They always say that the best thing to be is a hill farmer in Bhutan. Rubbish. Absolute rubbish. And it's the same with Scandinavia.
You've heard so many different points. The one about the migration from Africa, what aspects of the culture of Saudi and Somalia we might want to learn from. But why don't you give us a closing thought about where all this is going to end?
First of all, I have to reveal a conflict of interest. I'm an immigrant. I'm an immigrant in the United States, but I'm an immigrant. So I'm naturally sympathize with immigrants and to the struggle they have and to the richness that they bring. This said, I also understand the difficulties of integration. I think that when immigration is too big, it's not immigration, it's invasion, and people feel overruled and overtaken by different values. And this is not because he's Muslim or not Muslim. I think it can be Catholic versus Protestant, can be sort of people who eat rice versus people with pasta. I think that people value their cultural identities, and yes, food is a huge part of their cultural identity, and they feel overtaken. So I think that we should be a little bit more carefully managing the process to avoid the backlash that we observe today. But this backlash, I think that I really don't like what Doug said in identifying Muslim, because I think that I have not done the calculation, but I think that in this country more people died of Catholic terrorism than of Muslim terrorists. And in spite of that, you don't have the same level of anger versus Catholicism. So I think that is not, and I grew up in a country where there was political terrorists, and I can assure you it was not any better, and was homegrown. And so I think that we need to realize that when there are economic problems, ideological problems, there is the risk of extremism, and we need to deal with that. And dealing with that is not by criminalizing a religion or criminalizing a group. On the other hand, we need the support of that group. One way in which Italian homegrown terrorists, it was communist terrorists, was beaten at the time is because the then Communist Party basically isolated the terrorists. So I think that what you need to do is trying to bring closer the Islamic community and make sure that they isolate the few bad apples.
Thank you. Very, very good. Well, it's no surprise to anyone we have not perhaps reached a consensus. We have certainly not resolved these huge issues. We've generated quite a lot of heat, but I think in the process also, I think, some light. I hope it's been illuminating for all of you. Please, will you, I hope, join me in thanking our very, very informed panel, Paul Collier, Elise Shafak, Luigi Zingales, Christine Ockrent, and Douglas Murray. Thank you all very much. Thank you.